Thank you for joining us on Collective Action Magazine, where we're all about gender-based violence. The reason why I'm so excited, not just me, I think my team, to be talking to you because you are the fundi when it comes to trauma. I think, which is the basis of, I think, a lot of the ills that we encounter post our encounter with tragedy. And it's something that is not well understood or even spoken about. So it's just, in this edition, we just wanted to talk more about trauma and how we can heal from trauma. So when we identify the root cause, it's just so much easier for us to navigate the healing space. So this is the conversation we want to have with you today. I mean, you're a renowned psychologist, and this is your forte. So we're quite excited to have you on Collective Action Magazine. Thanks, Islam.
It's an honor. It's really, really an honor to be here. This is, something that's very close to my heart. It's not just work. It's, I think, purpose. So it's just an honor. Thank you for having me here, and congratulations.
Thank
you.
Really,
I mean, it's only gonna be if we work together as a collective.
Absolutely.
That we address this pandemic of SGBV. So I'm really excited to be part of just not an individual, but a collective that is trying to make a difference.
Thank you, Sis Nom. So we want to know more about you. Tell us about Sis NOMFUNDO. NOMFUNDO.
Briefly, okay, so NOMFUNDO Mogapi is the name. I think, as you said, by training, I am a clinical psychologist. I started an organization called the Center for Mental Wellness and Leadership, CMWL. People say it's long, but I like it because it forces people to pause, and wonder, like, mental wellness and leadership. And the reason I really started this organization is because, as a psychologist, having worked in the field of violence, peace building, sexual and gender-based violence, and working with government, AU, I really realized that there is a big missing piece in our interventions and programming, and just also in how we do work as organizations. And it was really understanding how trauma impacts the work that we do. And so, I'm here to look at how to help individuals, organizations, leaders to, first of all, identify the trauma, but also when they've identified it, to be able to learn how they can transform it so it doesn't mutate their best intentions and interferes with the outcomes that people actually envision.
That's wonderful. So now that you've spoken about trauma, what is trauma?
I think that question is very important because, as you said, you were asking also about healing, because the beginning of healing is just awareness and awakening. And I think we are in a society where people don't even know that they are carrying trauma. But there's really two key issues that refer to trauma. The first one is external, so it is the experience itself and the nature of the experience. So I say classic in inverted commas because the field of trauma emerged from a medical field mainly after World War II. So there is a tendency when we define trauma to be quite medicalized, but there are those of us that are really pushing and saying, from what we are seeing, we need a broad understanding. But really, you're talking about an environment or an experience that is life-threatening, an experience sometimes that can be experienced as sudden. And the threatening is not just you being threatened physically, but also psychologically, sometimes your own integrity. So something that attacks your sense of integrity, where your boundaries are violated. And then there's an internal experience, which is how you experience it. So the classic trauma says there will be feelings of terror and fear when you are experiencing the trauma. So for me, I think that distinction is important. That is not just what you go through, but it's also how you respond. So you can have two people go through exactly the same thing, but one person gets traumatized by the event and another one doesn't get traumatized by the event, because there's a whole lot of other things that have an impact in terms of the reaction. But I think a broader thing for me is the word trauma comes, I think it's from a Greek word that talks about the injury of the soul. So I think for me, a broader definition is to really understand a traumatic experience as those experiences that create the injury of our psyche, if you are a classic psychologist,
Mm-hmm.
or you can say a soul. So that injury to the soul that then of course dents how you see things, how you respond to things, and how you show up. And there's a whole lot of symptoms that people look at. But I think the three classic symptoms we look at is that people will either re-experience the trauma, where you are in a space where you feel and re-experience trauma is really different from sitting and thinking about something that happened to you and that was painful. It's like when you think of that experience, you are transported to the time when it happened. You re-experience it. The pain is fresh. I mean, you'll have people who say, I'm 40 something, but when I remember what happened to me as a 10-year-old, I'm literally transported to being that 10-year-old girl. Then there will be a cluster of symptoms where you try to avoid the trauma, where you try to avoid anything that reminds you. So there's a whole concept of triggering that I usually talk about when I train people, where we talk about how triggering can be anything, Hazel, anything. It can be anything that your senses can have, sound, smell, anything that reminds you of the trauma, transports you there. So you're likely to have a conversation, like, someone who looks like someone that had you. But what then happens is that because when you re-experience the trauma, it is so painful, the reaction is to try and avoid it, right? So could avoid the conversation, people could avoid the relationships, anything that might take you to that trauma experience. But this is really important because the tendency of when you struggle with trauma, and I think all of us in South Africa, by the way, struggle with trauma, so I don't think it's just certain individuals, but the tendency is that you then oscillate, right? You spend a lot of your psychological energy moving between the intrusion and the avoidance, the intrusion and the avoidance. And so you end up being depleted psychologically. You don't have the energy to spend in things that are important, like being a parent, working. So like your day-to-day functioning gets really significantly affected. For kids, it could be schooling. And then the final cluster is the cluster that we call hyperarousal. So what it basically means is that just your nervous system is on hyperarousal. You are constantly alert or scared, or any bang, anything that reminds you, shouting. So all of those are like the huge clusters, right? So a lot of people that work in the trauma field speak about those broad clusters. And that is like, you can imagine, Hazel, that is only one symptom of trauma. But what we are beginning to, and the work that you do, and a lot of my work is about making us to understand, especially in what I call wounded or traumatized context, that we are dealing with multiple layers of trauma. So think of it, what I've just described is if you've gone through one incident of trauma, but some of us have gone through prolonged trauma. Some of us have gone through repeated trauma at a personal level, which then of course complicates things. But there's also the whole concept of collective trauma, that actually collectives can experience trauma of their own, and that collectives can respond in ways that are traumatic. Like now as a country, with this shutdown, I mean, we're also scared, right? Because we are thinking of incidences when our collective trauma can actually be triggered by just a simple thing and we quickly go into violence. Trauma can be historical. Some of us carry historical trauma. So sometimes, so that's why this work is so important, right? Because if I am a survivor of SGBV or a victim, depending, I always tell people I choose whether I want to call myself a victim or survivor. And my mother was a victim or survivor and didn't deal with it, and the grandmother didn't deal with it. At the times, the intensity of the pain is that I'm dealing with my pain, but I'm also dealing with their pain because we transfer it to the next generation. And finally, I talk about how trauma is embedded within our systems. Is structural. We don't talk a lot about structural trauma, that some of the systems that we have in our institutions and organizations could actually result into traumatization. Like if women go to the hospital, how they get treated, that in and of itself can actually be structural trauma.
What you've explained is somebody that's actually aware of the trauma, so you know what happened, so it's easy to either become triggered or go through the whole sensitization triggers. What about somebody who does not remember what happened? It may be something that happened, they were 1 or 2 and they can't remember, or their mind blocked it. and I can't remember, but they keep having these reoccurrences. What kind of trauma is that, and how does a person recognize that they're being traumatized or they're struggling with trauma?
That's a very important question. And you said that what I'm talking about is people that are aware, but it's actually not, huh? I mean, you'll be surprised, Hazel, how many of us constantly react from a space of trauma and we don't even know. And for me, that is the biggest crisis of South Africa, is so many people that are carrying this injury of the soul. We don't even know that we are injured. Wow. And I always talk about this quote that if we are injured and we don't heal, we bleed on those that didn't cause the injury. So, and unfortunately, the majority of us don't even know what it is that is triggering us. Because remember, again, some of us, if it is historical and collective, if my mother didn't talk to me, I don't even know what she's gone through. So the way in which you know is about beginning to know yourself better. Yes. I always call it the 10. The one thing I also wanted to say, Dr. Van der Kolk wrote this book called The Body Keeps the Score. Right? So you may not remember it in your mind, but your body remembers it. Yeah, the body stores the trauma, and the body will respond. So you don't forget it. You forget it in your cerebral cortex, but the body doesn't forget. So there are certain things you can see. There's a thing I talk about it. I call it the 10%, 90% principle, where just, I tell people that the first journey of healing is that you need to cultivate curiosity about yourself. We live in a society that makes us to be so curious about other people, and that's trauma. Also, trauma makes you to not look inside. So we're always curious about who's wearing how they look. I mean, for me, that's initially a sign, right? Because you don't look inside. And I say we need to cultivate, like, spending a lot of time and being curious about ourselves. Like, so when Hazel said that thing, there's something that happened to me. Like, what exactly happened? So when you have this 10%, 90% principle, where 10% is about what Hazel might have said. Hazel talks about my makeup. 10% is like, ooh, I'm embarrassed. But 90% could be the shame that I carry, which might come from my family around how I look, how I get presented, what that means about who I am as a person, as a woman, as a Black woman. So there's a whole conversation that happens, right? We've got, like, the inner dialogue is so powerful. I've done work with other people, just like a whole session on the inner dialogue that we have, the conversations. And I mean, it's interesting that the same parts of our body that get activated when we have, like, conversations with others are the same part of our brain that gets activated when we have conversations with ourselves. So they are very, very powerful. So it's really being curious, Hazel, about where are the moments in my life where I have a 90% reaction instead of a 10% reaction to something. Those could be the moments where the trauma is, right? So the entry to healing is not the event. There are a few people who know what they've gone through and they can actually make the linkages, but most of us don't. And unfortunately, we do that with children. We're doing some work with young people who have lost their parents during COVID. So this young person has lost her mother, and she used to do so well in grade 10. Now she's in grade 12 and she's not passing. But no one says, come on, there's a link between what happened. And that's why this book that Oprah wrote, that I always talk about, What Happened to You, is so critical. Absolutely. Because our biggest work is to be curious about what happened to us, because what happened to us is then what is likely to cause the triggers.
Okay. That's very informative, Sister NOMFUNDO. Thank you for going deeper into this. How do we now then unlock the trauma? So I'm basing this question on a session that you once held and I had the privilege to be a part of, where you spoke about the medulla.
Yes, yes.
If you can take us through that, because that was very striking for me. I think I learned quite a lot. And I think I started going through my process of healing. If you could please just take us through, and how do we unlock the trauma? Even if you're not aware. I mean, we start by being curious, but how do we unlock it?
The role of the medulla oblongata is to help us to wake up, to sleep. It is really, so our brain is created in hierarchies. So the lowest part of our hierarchy is the medulla oblongata. And it saddens me, right, in terms of how our education was packaged, because that's what we were taught. And I'm like, no. So I then also talk about the amygdala.
Yes.
So the amygdala is that small part of the brain that is there to support us during threat and protect us. And all it knows to do is to fight, is to freeze, and to flight. So that is where we store our trauma. But for us to function, to be parents, to work, to do whatever we do, we need our cerebral cortex. So what then happens is that if we don't heal, the trauma is stored in our amygdala. And anything that reminds us of the trauma triggers the amygdala. And unfortunately, when our amygdala is working, the cerebral cortex doesn't work. So at times we really wonder why we cannot function in other moments. Because literally, I mean, I've explained to you the multiple levels of our traumatization. I've explained the whole process of triggering that. It can be anything and everything. So you can just imagine that if you don't heal, you are likely to be constantly operating from the space of the amygdala. And the things that the amygdala, first of all, has no language. Yeah. You can't even articulate what you are going through. I don't know whether you've been in those spaces where you're just talking to someone and you can't even explain that could be because you are in the heart of the trauma. And also the danger of the amygdala, because the amygdala is there to protect you. So the amygdala doesn't sit and like take information and analyze it before it responds, right? The amygdala just gets information and responds. So you likely to have an exaggerated response to things that you see as a threat and end up either attacking things or freezing or flying away without having found out, the full extent of what the story is. I've been there, where you then start to tell yourself stories in your head about why people do certain things and why things happen, stories in your head about yourself. Yeah. The understanding of the neurology of the brain, neuropsychology, is teaching us a lot about the importance of healing and how if we don't heal, the people that suffer is not the people that have hurt us. Unfortunately, it is us and those that we love, because our brain sabotages us, right? We have brains that are literally arrested, because really that's what it is. You've got arrested brains that are not able to function because of the amygdala having been activated.
We have 3 responses: flight, freeze, and
fight,
flight,
and freeze. I mean, other people add another one that is called posturing. It happens a lot with males, when animals are fighting and they try to be bigger than they are. So yeah, other people add that.
Okay, that's wonderful. Now you touched a bit on healing. So I want us to now just step into the healing space. I remember you ran a program called Women in Leadership. I just want to unpack that in terms of women, because we are quite active in the society in a lot of spaces, but we carry a lot of wounding. I wanted to find out from you, what are some of the signs of, for example, a woman in leadership that is carrying trauma within the community space? What are some of the telltale signs that this person could be carrying trauma?
Yeah, so I think it's important that also when we look at different levels of traumatization, that we just also understand patriarchy. So this class is patriarchy, racism, all of these actually other experiences, right, that could be traumatic. And patriarchy really falls under historical trauma together with racism, because there is the pain that women generally carry, but then there's an added pain that is carried by Black women, right, because of just the combination of these. When we are talking about patriarchy, the message is that patriarchy is sent to us that then cause this injury of the soul is, first of all, the sense that you are less than because you are a woman. So at the core of it is the attack of our worth. Now, the wound of worth is a wound of narcissism. So there's a huge issue about narcissism, right? Because when your worth gets attacked, then you have narcissistic injury. And then you find different ways of trying to protect that pain, right? And you can protect that pain either by the posturing, taking up your authority and being really aggressive in how you do it. And that is called inflated ego. Or you can do it by having the deflated ego, where you tend to lower yourself, lower your light, make yourself less than, you compromise your boundaries, you allow people to walk over you, and sometimes you even move in between the two, right? So because of our society, and I think because of patriarchy, the majority of women are likely to operate from a deflated ego. And there are times when you even have this imposter syndrome. When you're given that authority and power, you don't feel like you belong. So you don't fully step into your power, or you can actually move into the other side. So there's a lot of work that we need to do in understanding the injury that patriarchy has done. And for me, I think the gift, Hazel, of doing this trauma work is two things. The first one, it helps us to drop judgment, because I think there is so much judgment that we put towards women that are in position of power, because we don't fully appreciate what does it take to succeed in a deeply wounded and patriarchal society. That just immediately judges you. You feel it, right? But also you've got it internalized, because we internalize some of these negative messages about ourselves and our worth. So there's just that work that you get put in this position of power. At times you don't even know how deep the wound is until you get given power, and because power exposes narcissistic injury, right? So that's why people will be like, oh, what happened? But because, like, when I'm in power, I'm in the spotlight, and it's really difficult to hide myself. Leadership is really, really challenging in that context. So for me, it's about really beginning to appreciate and understand how we can support women that are in power, instead of becoming judgmental over either saying they're either too aggressive or too submissive. And how do we begin to bring coaching to support us? And I think the other wounding is that because there's patriarchy then defines how you need to show up as a leader. Racism defines that. And I mean, and it's so easy to assimilate and lose yourself. And I remember when I was starting in my journey as a leader, I entered in, and I just think after a few years, even my colleagues said, we don't see you. And I couldn't see myself, because I started trying to sound, like the people that are in power. Because for you to be successful, you need to have seen yourself in the face of power. Yes. But we've never done that. So what then happens to you? Because then you have to show a different way of being, because it contradicts the mainstream. Then the messages are either you are weak, you are not enough, or as a woman, you are too aggressive. So it can be really difficult and lonely to be in the journey. And for me, that's why I was really, really excited when the Mental Wellness Initiative entered into the project of supporting Black women executives, understanding the complexities of what it means to be a leader in a wounded context.
Wow, wounded leadership.
Yes.
Yeah,
my whole work. Look, I mean, the reason why my organization is so long and people pause is because the first part of my work is about helping people to say, how do you become mentally well? How do you transform the trauma? So let's give you the skills and the tools of being able to know the trauma, identify it, but also respond to it and transform it. But also my other focus is on leadership, because my understanding is that in a context with this deeply embedded leadership wounding at all these levels, really for me, there's two places where the solution comes: at a family level, so if we can have transformed families, and also at a leadership level. So leadership is at the core. So I talk a lot about wounded leadership in traumatized context, because I think we can be helped on how we can be able to ensure that our wounds don't interfere with the work that we actually want to do. And the thing, when Hazel, is that most of us who enter in this space, especially the SGBV, are ourselves survivors.
Yes.
Right? And that's why we do. That's what makes our work unique in this field, right? Is because there's something that it touches in us.
Yes.
So if we're really not aware how then the very same thing that attracted us to the work can bleed on the organizations that we create, we could sabotage our work. I mean, it's the same thing with countries like South Africa, where people who create our country come because they are passionate, but they come being wounded soldiers. And if they don't find a way to heal these wounds, and they continue to lead from this bleeding place, then they bleed on our country, which is why we're seeing things like what we're seeing now.
Absolutely.
So it's a very, it's a very delicate area where we need to really activate empathy without judging people's experience, but also saying you've got to understand the cost of doing this work.
You recently did a report on Lusigi being the rape capital of South Africa. That is scary for starters. Yeah. I remember reading end of last year's SAP report, and the most common and the highest reports on gender-based violence is actually rape and sexual assaults. What was your finding? How has Lusigi become the rape capital of South Africa?
Look, I mean, it has just been an honor to be part of this project. And this is a project that we did in partnership with the Old Mutual Foundation. And we had the Deputy Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture, Umamunotawe Mafu, coming to us and talking to Sisfikile Kuhlase from Old Mutual, saying, I'm very concerned about what's happening in Lusigi. And I think what was surprising for us was that these are communities that were historically quiet. Of course, they've been like very rapidly urbanized, but they still are rooted in villages. So they work a lot with villages around them. And we were like, what's happening? Because Lusigi was sort of number 1 and Thohoyandou was number 5, according to the stats that we got during the summit in November last year. So she then just said, please go and do something. And most of my work is around trauma-informed sexual and gender-based violence. And it is important to differentiate between trauma-focused sexual and gender-based violence and trauma-informed sexual and gender-based violence. Because trauma-informed is about saying, how do we understand trauma? How do we support the survivors to heal? And that's very, very important work. And there's quite a few organizations that are doing that work that also need to be capacitated. We need people who support victims or survivors to be trained on trauma and to be trauma focused. But trauma informed is about understanding that all of us are traumatized. It's about understanding that as I do this work, everyone I interface with, whether it's my staff members, my managers, my board, has been affected by trauma. And therefore I need to use the trauma lens in everything I do, from working with the survivors, from the policies that I do, from how I govern as the board. So then she invited us to come and do that work. So when we went there, we just investigated, tried to find out what is happening. And what I like is they had an SGBV combat team, which is really the localization of the NSP. Amazing, amazing work that Abonyameka and others are doing, which made our work easy. I think what's interesting for me is that for both, and in Thohoyandou they didn't have, so we've helped them. So we actually launched, Dr. Notawe Mafu came this Saturday to launch the Thohoyandou SGBV combat team. So we're really, really excited about how do we begin to sort of replicate that collective approaches that are led from the collective, not just government, right? Very active civil society. And the unique thing about that is working with chiefs and royal leadership and navigating that. I know that within the SGBV sector, there's a lot of discussions around how do we bring this, but a lot of traditional leaders or royal leadership, what we've identified is that they are the ones that have access to men. So if we really want to begin to focus on the pillar that looks at prevention, we need to see bring them in. And most of them were coming and willing and saying, NOMFUNDO, we do have challenges. We may not say them publicly. Come and train us. Let's look at that. So that's really just so the first one was to really strengthen the SGBV combat team in its work. We trained about 50 social workers working in partnership with the social development. So National worked together with local social workers, and we trained them of trauma-informed SGBV. And then we trained the SGBV combat team. We also worked with 50 stakeholders in Thohoyandou. I mean, there's so much to be learned. I can't list all of it. But I think the first thing that I am learning, the more I do this work, is that when we talk about solutions in our country, we talk about the public sector and the public servants. You know, we talk about the professional public servants to do the work. But most of them are highly burnt out and traumatized, completely exhausted. So there's a huge issue on how do we really support them. But also very few people have been trained on trauma-informed approaches. And there's a lot, unfortunately, from what we experienced in Lusigi and Thohoyandou, I don't know about other areas, these are just pilots. a lot of the people that are doing the work are still fairly new in the sector. So they haven't been sufficiently trained. Just generally, some of them didn't know the NSP, they were like, what is SGBV? Almost all of them have not been trained on trauma and understanding trauma, and then on trauma-informed work. In Thohoyandou, we are working in partnership with the university, which has been really exciting to do that.
No, you're welcome to talk. You're the expert. We are all learning.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think for me, the main thing is like the importance of localizing the National Strategic Plan. Not just, I know there's work at provincial level, at district level, and our work is mainly at like a local level, municipal level, because that's where the work is taking place, right? That's where the work is happening.
Yes.
And both of these organizations, interestingly, like both of them were saying the reason we are so high is because we've done a lot of awareness. And so because of that, people are reporting. That's another very interesting dynamic as to what is the stats telling us. The more people do the work, there's a lot of work happening in Rusikisiki and Thohoyandou. So women are waking up, they're beginning to report. But the other thing that I learned is that in both these areas, domestic violence is not being reported, right? The final one, that I just want to touch, and people can refer to the report. One of the chiefs, said something powerful to us and said, NOMFUNDO, I want you to observe who are mainly the perpetrators of sexual assault. And he said, and I'm throwing it out there for us as the people in the field to think about it, because for me, I'm curious. He said, these are mainly youngsters that were born in the 80s. What happened in the 80s? We had the HIV/AIDS pandemic.
Yes.
And we never dealt with it. And he said to me, we're doing the same thing with COVID. We are not dealing with it. 20 years later, we will be surprised. So there's something that MEC Poppy from the Limpopo Health MEC said, when we were in Thohoyandou. She said that SGBV is a symptom, and SGBV is a mental health issue. Yes, it is a political issue, it's an economic issue, but I don't think we've fully appreciated it as a symptoms of a deeply wounded and traumatized society. So how do we deal with the political nature, the safety nature, the police nature of it, but also how do we then deal with the fact that it is a symptom of a deeply, deeply wounded and traumatized society that just keeps on cycling the problem.
I'm an 80s baby, so I am quite concerned.
Yeah, I mean, it's so, just outside SGB, because I also work with different organizations, right? And I can't say it's a trend because it's just the few people that I meet. Yes. But what I am seeing from the 80s babies, first of all, is this exacerbated family responsibility, right? So most of the 80s babies have got their responsibilities, but the ones that have been successful in the workplace are the ones that have to take care of their siblings, right? So for the majority of them, there isn't parents. They are the ones that carry that burden. So there's a lot of trauma and depression, and then there's a lot of conflict amongst siblings because they were born during the pandemic. Again, I mean, as a society, we never dealt with the collective trauma of apartheid. It is showing up.
Absolutely.
We never dealt with the collective trauma of HIV/AIDS. Now we are not dealing with the collective trauma of COVID-19. So we've got these layers of collective traumatization. Yes. So every time when I talk, I say doing SGBVF work in South Africa is not the same as doing it in a country like Denmark, because we are already coming in a society that has these multiple layers of deep, deep trauma that dealt with. So even the most well-designed systems and processes, if you put those in hands of traumatized people, you hear survivors saying, there's all these organizations, but when we go there, we get treated as less than. We don't feel treated as if we matter. You go to the practitioners, they tell you, we are tired and exhausted. Yeah. We go to the leaders, they're like, we're too exhausted, this board is toxic. We're going, so there's just, so I think for me, as we do the work on SGBV, we have to understand that as a collective, we are the vehicle of doing this work. And as we always say with trauma, it begins with me. If we can say, how can I be more of a healthy, healed leader who can then facilitate organizations of healthy, healed individuals who can be able to support survivors better. I think we can begin to at least ensure that we are operating from a healed space that facilitate the success of the work that we do.
You have your work cut out, Sis NOMFUNDO, because one of the things that's really coming out, if this is not dealt with, this is another compounded generational trauma.
Sure.
It's not just one thing that's we're passing at least 3 things that we know onto the next generation that's undealt with.
And understanding his, I mean, I have sleepless nights about these things, and I'm glad to have platforms like this, you know, to, even if it means that our generation plants the seed for the awakening, and the next generation, which is you guys with the 70s now, we're giving you guys to say, guys, do the work. And I think our daughters' generations, the ones that were born in the 2000s, beginning to, I mean, they say this, the late 90s, 2000s, the born freeze, right? They say this, they begin to say, guys, our biggest work is to heal ourselves. Because now the people that will sabotage the future of South Africa is going to be us. And now, I mean, Hazel, you just need to close your eyes and listen to the police stats. I remember I said that trauma is external and internal.
Yes.
If the police stats talks about millions of millions of people who experience violence, what does it mean? Like, what kind of a society are we having? Who are these people that are supposed to take South Africa forward if they don't deal with their trauma? So yes, I mean, our work is cut out for us. And I'm glad that we have the mental wellness initiative, because the idea of your work, guys, is that we really bring in a collective. We can't afford to do this work in our different corners. You know, we need to magnify what's happening. We need to do, at least we are doing it at a local level through Sikitoya, and hopefully we can do it in other places. You guys are working at national, you're bringing different organizations. We guys, we need to raise an army of healers, right? There's an army of economic, whatever. We need, the biggest work of this country is psychological liberation. So that's the thing that makes me restless and not sleep at night. I see it everywhere, and I'm like, sizovuka nini as a society, country, and understand that perhaps our biggest work is to heal ourselves.
Absolutely. That's a valid point, Sis NOMFUNDO. You mentioned 2 very important things. The first is the question that you posed. Who are the perpetrators? I mean, we've got victims. Who are the perpetrators? And we're constantly seeing the narrative of healing based on only the victims. When are we going to close the loop in terms of perpetrators and victims? Because it cannot be one side of the story.
It's a really difficult and painful conversation that we have to enter in. And I think those of us who have been working in this sector for the longest time, our children are the men.
Yes, yes. I have a son.
I mean, I know a lot of my friends will be like, okay, guys, when the perpetrators were like, you know, our partners or people outside, it was easier. Yes. But our children are the men, and we are the generation that had a lived experience. What does this mean?
Absolutely.
What does this mean to raise healthy men that don't perpetuate trauma, who are also raised by us as fathers and mothers? So we have experience as GBV. So if I've experienced GBV and I give a birth to a boy child, how am I raising him? And if I haven't healed, what then happens? So there's a whole conversation, but all we know is that from the trauma field, one type of violence, right, is being exposed to prolonged, repeated violence at home. So what we know is that young boys that are exposed to prolonged, repeated violence at home are much more likely to be perpetrators of trauma later on. And every time I have this conversation, Hazel, I even I'm scared, because I know even now, I know my sister feminists are gonna be like, "Hey, NOMFUNDO,
I know,
not our battle, Jonga." And we've been saying, okay, guys, can we start dealing with the boy child? But I think what we are beginning to understand is that, which I mean we all know, but it was emphasized for us in the Sikitoya, is that the perpetrators are not people you see out there and you call perpetrators. They are your normal guy. They are your friends. They are your uncle. They are your colleagues. And I think for me, the scariest thing is that when they even talk, their understanding of a perpetrator is this monster out there. So they don't even see themselves as perpetrators. Like they have no clue. Some of them are even fighting the battle. So it's a curious conversation, and we need to have that conversation without abandoning the conversation around the emancipation of women, the healing for women.
Absolutely.
We shouldn't, because I think what has happened is that we've had this almost like black and white approach of if we work with women, but then we abandon that. Even with donors, we need to do both work. Right? There's work that needs to be done with perpetrators, and I'm glad because the National Strategic Plan focuses on healing and response, which is the pillar 4, but then it also focuses on prevention, and it focuses. It's so interesting. When we were in Toyando, the 50 stakeholders that we've trained, and this is like from royal leadership, this is social workers, the police, this is civil society, university. What they liked the most, I think, is pillar 5. Give me the economic empowerment. They said, oh wow, this is the pillar that we need the most. So the links between economic empowerment, relationship with money, and GBV is also something that came up very strong.
Okay.
So yeah, that's what we're learning.
So the reason why I actually brought up the whole two sides is because according to the national strategy is that it talks about women and children. And it's so important that we protect, or we find ways of not continuing this generational trauma, but we've got to have some level. I know the whole being careful in the space in terms of when we talk about perpetrators and victims, we have to be very careful because it's a very sensitive topic, but we do have the next generation to worry about. And how do we close that gap? And that's why I was asking that question. How do we then close that gap?
Yeah. So I think working with children, all the children, right? And really working with their traumas, because that will have an impact on how they show up in the future.
Absolutely.
But really, like, working with the male or boy child is going to be quite important for us. And for me, I think being able to heal that wound that child actually carries, because the future perpetrator, I always say that inside the majority, there are few that, I've seen cases of like antisocial personality disorder, people that just need to react extreme, but also there are those who are inside, there is a traumatized boy.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do we access that young traumatized boy? How do we assess these children? How do we assess these girls and boys? So for me, I think the work with children, it's really at the core of how we need to move forward. And the work with children means that how do you help me if I have experience as GBVF? How do I get supported as a parent to can be able to parent these children?
You spoke about Lusigisigi and Toyando, and how in Toyando, the most urgent and pressing need that they need is economic emancipation for the women. What is your finding in Lusigisigi? What is the most pressing need?
Interesting. So what was interesting in Lusigisigi, there was this whole conversation that the agenda of SGBVF seems to be the agenda of politicians and these activists that they are coming. But communities didn't see it as the most pressing thing.
Okay.
So for them, again, the most pressing thing was the economic stuff, right? So then the question was, how do you bring in the agenda of GBVF in a way that will make people to hear and listen? So there was a lot of work around just the awareness and understanding what SGBVF is at a community level. And it felt for like the activists and the people that were doing the work, like they were doing the work alone. It was a lonely journey because communities, there wasn't that communal support to say, yeah, it is a problem. We actually see it and we're going to support you. Let us deal with it. And I think for them, what was similar in both of them was that the sexual, especially the sexual violence, was perpetrated a lot by the younger people, and there's a whole conversation. But there was a lot of GBV in families of the older generation, but it wasn't spoken about. So I think the stats of the gender-based violence which I think, let me not say sexual, because there is sexual violence in the homes, let me not say, but the one that is the stranger rape is the one that gets reported a lot by younger people, or maybe even people that they know, because they know they are awake, they go there, but the elder people are not reporting, they are not even calling it GBV. And that's the question, that so if these old people, older generation are raising these young people, what then happens then, like how they get ostracized. And the whole issue of the LGBTQI plus community was a big issue in actually both. And the silence and the lack of, like, the need of pulling in the faith communities a bit more was also raised there. Yeah. We hope next time maybe to have a dialogue. The deputy minister was saying we need to bring the Sig and Toyando together. Lovely. So they can come and talk and say, guys, you know, what are we learning? Because what's happening here? So hopefully we can have that.
Are there any similarities between the two communities besides the level of violence, sexual violence between the two?
Look, I mean, just at the top of my head, because we've just kind of wrapped up the first phase of Itoyando now, and that's why I want us to bring back them here, because I think they are better able to articulate their experience than me. So please just filter my initial reflection from that space, that I'm not an expert of that. But I think, as I said, that for us, the first thing is that they both were originally rural. The rural community quickly urbanized. So Toyando is really the center of most of the villages, the same as Lusikisiki. So there's something there about how, you know, urbanization happens, what happens when people leave villages and they come hoping to get money, and they come in and they don't get, because there's employment and all of that. So there's a big thing that's happening there. I think the other similarities is that they've got very deeply rooted cultures, which can be a strength, right? Because you can access the traditional leadership and you can be able to use them. But they can also be a challenge when the culture is not deconstructed. So how do we enter without immediately saying, your culture is wrong, it's harmful, but to really deconstruct what works? What are the harmful practices and what are the practices that might be problematic? I think surprisingly, both of them have got vibrant civil society, active people that are doing the work on the ground. I mean, the police were there present, same in both of the areas. But I think just them feeling overwhelmed. So one of the biggest thing also is that this is the dynamic, right? That bigger NGOs in urban areas are getting funding and support for this work. But most of these NGOs are doing work for free. So there is no support. People will go and say, I haven't had a salary for 3 months, but I'm doing this work. So the capacitation and the support, and most of them, they don't have like the rigorous processes that you need. And that's why for us, we're pushing that, okay, why don't you have the SGBV combat team? Let's support the combat team. And then if the combat team is strong, then it can give, you know, funding and support these other organizations. So I think for me, it's that contradiction, like vibrant civil society people, I mean, like brilliant minds that are doing this work. And then there's the increased deaths that is actually happening there. So it's something that we just need to be curious about. But I think finally, deeply rooted historical traumas that in both communities. They are different depending on their histories, but really deeply and very sort of entrenched patriarchy. And the interesting thing, but this is just me from outside, the NOMFUNDOs are very proud nation, very proud amongst they don't even want to be called Amaxhosa. We call them Amaxhosa in South Africa, but they are really proud. And also the Venda nation is very proud. So there's also that thing of these men that are really proud. So what happens when they don't have jobs, they don't have employees, they are not. So there's just a lot of, and it's not only the poor men that do that, but what happens when they also have jobs? So there's something very interesting about pride, which can be a real strength if you are not wounded. But when you have a deep-seated sense of pride and you are really wounded because of our society, something else happens. So yeah, some of the, thank you for these questions, because now you've really challenged me. I need to go back in the drawing board with our researcher and just analyze what's emerging from these two communities. I think there's some really important learnings that might emerge, because the other one is, I was thinking of it, you know, the other one is there in the north and the other one is down there in the east, so far from each other, but they're in the top 5 of GBV. So we need to really be curious and understand what's happening.
We're also curious to know. So once you find out, we're going to call you again.
Yes,
to
yes,
share
in
with
the
us.
next year, yeah.
Next edition. So in closing, I'm just going to write off your last statement around trauma and healing. For somebody who recognizes that I'm deeply traumatized, what do I do? Where do I even start? What's your recommendation?
Hazel, when I am in my spaces, there's this thing that I say, I call it hashtag 10 sessions per person. I think every single South Africans need to have a minimum of 10 sessions in therapy. I hope my government
Be the
hears
first
me.
one.
Or a donor hears me. Can we just have a fund like every South African goes through? I think we should have done that. And so that being said, understanding that we're all affected, I think for me, the first journey of healing is just that awakening. So if you can identify it, you are 50% towards doing that work. And then second, if you can afford it and you have the luxury of being able to see someone, please invest in healing and going to someone who's trained. There are some organizations that do the work. Call them up and say, I need to come and do work and do counseling. But what I liken from the work that I've done, and if you look at the book that was written by Oprah Winfrey, is that healing doesn't just happen in the therapy room. There are spaces. So identify possible spaces of healing in your life. For example, having friends that you can call up and say, Mgani, how are you? What's happening in your life today? And having a space to offload. That's such a valuable space. How do we transform the conversations we have with each other as friends and how we begin to talk about what is happening inside of us? Do the ABCs of self-care, right? Like walking, it's free. I mean, for those, if you do really have the gift, I understand again, of safety, you may not be able to, even if you walk around, just because trauma is stored in the body. So if you walk, you do it like a physical activity, you are able to connect to your body, almost help yourself to can be able to release the trauma. The basics of like sleeping right, eating right, all of those things just help your body to remember that we say it is an injury to the soul. It really also has an impact in your body. So find spaces where you can be able. Other things that we know help is to have spaces where you reflect. You may not have a therapist, just invest time. Some people will do it like at the end of each week or end of each month. They have a reflective journal where they say, let me go inside, what's happening for me? Just the capacity to pause and get inside. It's so powerful in beginning to facilitate healing. Go for coaching if you can be able to afford coaching or do some work around coaching. And it might seem crazy, Hazel. When I was in Toyando, for some people, their brain popped. They were like, what? Their eyes popped when I said, you need to learn to play. Learn to play. Okay. Just create that space, because when you play, you connect with your cerebral cortex. You are able to activate it. It helps you to process whatever is happening. And children are a gift, Learn to play. Whatever it is that helps you to play. Play with the children. Draw if you draw. Just have something that helps you to play. Yes. Because in that space, that's where the healing happens. Yeah. And finally, Hazel, I appeal that we activate grace and empathy for ourselves first and for the people around us, like kindness to self, because when you go into this journey, you realize the work, and we don't have time to talk about the inner critic. That's a conversation for another time. That part of you that makes you feel guilty when you are awakened. So as you do this journey, absolute empathy, kindness, grace for yourself. You are doing the best that you can, and forgive the parts of you that were too wounded to understand what to do at that time, and allow yourself to be in the present and do the healing.
Thank you, Sis NOMFUNDO. I love the fact that you provided healing that's accessible, and that's a good start for anybody that's looking for it. But thank you for coming on. This was very valuable, and we're looking forward to more of these sessions. We need to hear more from you.
Yes. We'll have a series. Let's see how people respond. Who knows? Yes. Thank you so much. Let's see what the market says. Thanks, Hazel.